Hello. So today's lecture is another one of those where I just say, oh, this is my absolute favorite. I just love what can be learned from the combination of material history, in particular here, trees, archaeology, which comes in to supplement art and architectural historical knowledge, and the engineering and building traditions of Japan in particular, which come in large part, or at least are largely influenced by building practices in both China and Korea. We're focusing on Japan in this section because one of the largest and oldest wooden structures on the planet can be found there. Let's take a look. Okay, before we take a look, we are now in sort of the second full week of the course. We've done a lot so far, and we still have a bit to go, but I want to review how far you've come and where we're going. I want to do that by just taking a... But I want to give you the opportunity to take about 5 minutes. For those of you doing this asynchronously, you'll do it on your own, to write down 3 key takeaways that you have learned or gathered from the class so far. These can be particulars about buildings, but I'm aiming more for kind of an overarching set of takeaways. For example, how will they inform your life after the class? How might they inform your prospective career, travel, and perspective in general? Take a few minutes, email me what you've got. All right, back into the lecture. Our objectives for the class today will be as follows. We'll be analyzing the evolution of forms using archaeology in combination with architectural history, and we'll take a quick look at contrapposto. Our material study is wood, and we'll be looking at a series of architectural styles and sites. We'll be looking at the style of the pit houses, and then for sites, we'll be looking at Izumo Taisha, Ise-jingu, Horyuji, and Todaiji. Let's get our temporal bearings. We're beginning in the Nara period. This period covers roughly 710 to 794 CE. And except for a 5-year period in that span, this is when the capital was briefly moved. Nara remained the capital of the growing Japanese consolidated civilization. Japanese society during this period was largely agricultural, and they were centered around village life. But what's taking place in the Nara period is a move toward communal consolidation, toward religious consolidation, and toward a consolidation of power. Much of this happens in the juggling of the traditional practice of Shintoism and what becomes a new practice of religious worship, Buddhism. This map predates the Nara period, clearly, but what it does show you is just the way in which the people on the island of Japan saw themselves as individual nations. You could call them tribes or clans, but we really want to think of them as small nation states that operated independently from one another. During the Nara period, those independent states began to look toward one central area, and this is Nara, which is in that region where all of the little Google map drops are showing on this map, just south of Kyoto. You can see the shrines highlighted by those red site markers. And of course, there's one off to the west that we'll begin with as we begin to look at the architecture of this period. Before we get there, though, I want to start with thinking about building with wood. Take 2 to 3 minutes and look very carefully at this image. take notes on what you see, what stands out, what's happening in the image, what it tells us, and email those to me. Go ahead and pause the video so you can take the time to do that. Now that you've formulated a few thoughts on the image, let's look at what's happening there. One of the first things pointed out in class is often the use of these tools that look something like shower heads, maybe. You can see the curved form. These are called adze. They are a traditional Japanese tool used by carpenters from the earliest times until today, even for traditional carpenters. These are, you can think of them like a garden hoe, but instead of being rectangular at the end, they have that triangular, that flared triangular shape. They're generally made of iron. What else is going on? We have several different dynamics, right? Front and center in the foreground of the image, we have a series of workers. You can see their effort level by the fact that many of them have taken off their shirts to indicate they're hot, they're working hard. Their poses are very active. They're in the midst of treating the wood in many different stages. They're removing the bark on these two parallel but diagonal structures here on the left with about 6 workers, 6 carpenters gathered together. Just to the right of them, you can see a series of progressions from a complete log in the very front in the foreground being cut using some very, very high-tech tools for the time. Right above them, we see 2 figures who are doing some measuring using string in order to make sure that that board, that plank, is going to fit the desired specifications. Above that, we have more work being done on the surface, and on until we reach the finished planks that are at an angle there at the very back, not quite to the full left corner of the image. So that gives us an idea of the workings of the site. At the same time, we have 2 figures off to the right standing up, one in a white shirt with green pants. He is pointing. It's a clear sign that he's giving orders. And in some way, he is giving orders or pointing toward this grid that's been mapped out with some sort of string that is showing us the foundations for the building to come. On the left side of the image, top left, we have what looks like a communal gathering. The workers have stopped, they're eating lunch, they're having tea, they're having breakfast. We don't know which meal they're having, but they are gathered together, eating together, which shows us the all-encompassing nature of this work. They didn't go home to eat, they're staying there on site. And in the very front left, we have what almost looks like a scene of kids playing, maybe in a little sandbox. It looks like perhaps the builders have brought younger family members to the site as well. All that is being emphasized in this image is the importance of carpentry in Japanese architecture. There's a real emphasis on skilled woodworking that begins in the earliest days and carries forward to today. So while we're aiming toward the Nara period, in order to get there, our architectural history starts today in the Neolithic period, with a shift from hunter-gatherers to a more sedentary culture. We're at the site of Sanai Maruyama, which started around 4000 BCE, so 6,000 years ago, and it's thought to have ended around 2300 BCE, or 4,000 years ago. The site is critical because of its size. It covers 98 acres, and it endured for about 1,700 years. What that means is there is a plethora of architectural discoveries. As seen in many cultures of the same time around the world, we find pit houses, pit dwellings. They are created from locally harvested branches and a primitive form of thatched roofing, or an early form of thatched roofing. The remains of over 500 pit houses have been found on this site, and excavations began in 1957 and lasted till 1963 by researchers at Keio University, among others. Breakthroughs came in 1992 while the site was being studied and considered for a large baseball stadium, when they found these architectural remains of a vast culture. The stadium was relocated somewhere else. One of the important features that we're seeing here in the image on the left is this 6-pillar building, thought to be maybe a lookout tower. It's also one of the first examples of dug foundations, meaning it's these posts that we're seeing on this post and lintel structure they exist far below the ground plane. The ground has been dug out, the posts have been raised and set down into that dug foundation. This sort of foundation is one that we'll see carrying forward. So now inside the pit house. This is that largest structure on the first image, being shown here on the bottom right, now in cross section. You can see I've outlined where the ground plane is, and you can see from that staircase on the right, if you were outside on top of the grass, that's where the ground would hit. The structures have been dug out into the dirt. Just think for a minute, what's the purpose of that? What's gained by creating a sunken layer to this form? It's often used for cooling. As we saw in the mud series earlier in the class, earth and mud have fantastic insulation properties that many other materials aren't able to replicate. So in this case, that we can see that there was a desire to cool this large gathering area. It's unclear whether this was used for gathering hall, eating hall, political meetings, or all of the above. It also could have been a market space. We see in the image on the left exactly the extent of this site. As mentioned, there are over 500 pit houses found here, 500 dwellings collaboratively. It really shows us how people 6,000 years ago lived and built. Going back to that same pit house, from the outside, what stands out? To an overwhelming degree, it's the roof. There's very little exposed wall, and 4/5 of what we see is that thatched, sloping roof. What are the conditions under which you might build this way? That pitched roof indicates there might have been some sort of precipitation, water perhaps, snow in the winter. And then do you notice those 3 little raised buildings just to the left of the pit house? We're going to take a closer look at those now. As people in the region started to cultivate crops and become more sedentary than they'd been before, they needed space to store their food. Most of the grains that they were trying to store wouldn't do well in those sunken pit houses. While the pit houses were successful in keeping things cool, they were not as successful at keeping things dry. And so the technique of elevating food stores is shown here in the granary. But it's not a granary, is it? You can see from my notes on the bottom, this is a religious pavilion. What's the connection between a granary and a religious pavilion? Why would both take on the same architectural form? If people lived in sunken spaces, why would they practice in raised spaces? What happened is the idea of preservation, of keeping the things that were vital and important to life elevated, of keeping those grain stores, of keeping the primary sustenance for the community raised up so it wouldn't get wet, raised up so it could be preserved. This extended into the thought about religious life. Food was essential and needed to be elevated. And in this case, the religious practice was seen as essential, and it too needed to be elevated. Whether this was thought to be the home of a god or the home of practitioners looking to a god, either way, this carryover from thinking about things that are sacred, like food supplies, to things that are sacred, like religious practice, took on the same architectural form as those concepts elided. Here's a little bit more of the site. You can see just how dug in those pit houses were. The three that we see here in the middle, of course, I mean, that's maybe 2 feet that stand up above the ground, and the rest is all roof. And then you can see the granary on the left and 2 more raised structures on the right. Again, just another glimpse of how vast this site was. This is primarily reconstructed architecture, taking cues from the posts that they found there, from the structures that did remain, and reconstructing it so that we can see now the influences of this ancient architectural type and form on modern day, or at least Nara's day, of architectural construction. Some of the architectural carryovers, things that you'll want to know in terms of architectural features for Japanese construction, are the toro, which are those visible interior rafters that are shown in the upper left. The chigi, which are those tall, extenuated beams that are coming up in almost a V shape on top of the roof. Those began as structurally necessary to balance out the different physical conditions of the roof, and they have carried over today into a more decorative structure, which you'll see in the following slides. In the bottom left, we see the dug foundations like we saw at that tower just a few minutes ago, where the mud has been removed, it's been dug out, piers have been set in, and this forms the foundation for the building. This was the primary means for constructing elevated structures until around the 6th and 17th century, due to exchange with China. This new mode of foundation setting, stone foundation setting, was carried over into Japanese architecture. What this means is that large stones were, again, the ground was dug out, large stones were put in the ground, the stones were hollowed, and the piers were set into the stone themselves. What are the advantages? They're twofold. One, of course, the wood pier is protected from water in what would otherwise be damp earth by that stone layer of protection. And of course, it creates more rigidity and strength by giving the piers a stone base. How do we know this? A lot of the architectural insight that we have into these very early ancient Japanese structures comes from this series of clay figures that are now at the National Museum in Tokyo. These hanewa, or clay figures, show us the form of the granary, the religious structures, and even a palace or home structure. So here you see the granary at the left and the religious pavilion at the right. Now we're used to seeing little mock-ups or models of houses in such a way that this granary on the left looks almost as if there's a very large window on its first floor and a small window at the top floor. But that's not how these represented to the people who created them. Instead, that little flange near the bottom, which hopefully you can see here from the mouse, that represents the ground plane. And then those pieces that look to us like walls around that large bottom window on the left, those are actually pillars. They're those piers that we just looked at. And the only inhabitable structure or storage structure starts with that second platform just below the tiny window at the top. So it's important to learn how to read these. Instead of seeing them as walls, we need to see those downward structures as the piers and pillars that they were. All right. Finally, into Nara. Here's a timeline of events. Some of the shrines and temples that we'll be looking at fall before and just after the beginning of the Nara period. The beginning of the Nara period in the mid-6th century is marked by the construction of a national capital at Nara and the introduction of Buddhism from the Asian continent. During the Asuku period, a period of transition just prior to Nara, emissaries from the Korean kingdom, one of 3 kingdoms contesting control of the Korean peninsula, came to share Buddhism in exchange for help in war against the other 2 kingdoms against which they were fighting for the Korean peninsula itself. We can see in this image on the left a series of different ambassadors who came to Nara. This series of envoys that we see here, they represent Persian envoys, Malay envoys, and several different envoys from different regions of what is now China. When that group came from Korea, they also presented the very first Buddhist icon to the emperor at Nara, who then counseled his court as to what he wanted to do with it. Several important clans said, no, we're just not worshiping foreign gods, that's not an option. But the Soga clan understood the meaning of this and said, yes, we'll take it, we will. With that first Buddhist icon that you see here on the left, the Soga clan built an altar, and probably architecturally it was just an extension of part of one of their houses. Shortly after that, disease broke out and everyone blamed it on the worship of this foreign god, of this Buddhist practice, but the Soga were undeterred. Rearranging the power structure, they were able to refocus attention and leadership around the practice of Buddhism. And by doing so, they shifted political power over to themselves. The Nara era is also a period of great construction, as we saw with Queen Hatshepsut in Egypt, where the undertaking of large infrastructural projects really helped her consolidate her reign. The same is true of the Emperor at Nara. Today we're going to look at these 4 different sites. Izumo Oyashiro, also known as Izumo Taisha, Ise Jingu, Horyuji, and Todaiji. And for those of you who speak Japanese, please forgive my pronunciation. Here we are back to the map of the consolidated sites. And now on to the first shrine. It's thought to be the oldest shrine in Japan. This region of Izumo is one of several places that are thought to be the place where the gods descended to the earth. And so this very shrine has a long history of worship. The importance of Izumo Taisha is more than just architectural. This shrine, made up of a series of buildings, appears in more myths and more historical texts on Japan than any other building. It has a long and complicated history, and its effects on society and politics and the environment make it a perfect example for us to start with today. The shrine's been called so many things over the ages, but the primary significance here is that it's thought to be the home of the goddess who created Japan. Upon presenting Japan to the other gods, this goddess, Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and probably the most important god in Japanese mythology, was so pleased with what she created, was so pleased with Japan, that she had her descendants build a shrine there to worship Japan itself. Amaterasu is one of the figures worshipped in the inner shrine of Ise. So at the heart of Izumo Taisha is the structure called Izumo Handen. Take a minute to look at it. Similarities, differences from what we looked at before? First, we see that high-pitched roof. Here, more structured, more refined than we saw in the pit houses, but that same steep slope carried over. We also see the chigi here at the top, that sort of V-shaped structure that comes out at the very peak of the roof. It's no longer structural here, it's decorative. What else about this building? It is the largest shrine in Japan, and you don't get that idea when you see it, do you? But mythically, this shrine was thought to be bigger, taller than anything that anyone could even imagine existed. It was so fantastic that the story of this shrine actually was the only remaining history of the shrine was part of a children's book. As such, it was really unclear whether this was a true rendering of the building or if this is just, myth and childhood fantasy. What is written in that children's book is a description of Toraiji as being 148 feet tall. Excuse me, that's not right. Izumo is believed to be 16 jyo, or roughly 48 meters. This would be 157 feet, or about 15 stories tall. That's not what you see when you look at it, is it? In order for it to be 15 stories tall, and to follow the description in the children's book, it would need to look something like this. Now, as you look at the structure, keep in mind that those are human forms designed to scale in white, walking up this enormous staircase. Then notice the buildings over on the left. These were standardized structures, something familiar at this particular shrine. You can see how those little figures would fit spaciously inside any of the construction in the bottom left, and how they're just dwarfed by this huge thing shown front and center. So of course, that scale was thought to be apocryphal, absolutely not true, until around the 1980s, the Obayashi Corporation started a structural analysis of what exactly would be required to create a building of that enormity. You can see the size of those beams, those cypress beams would have to be gigantic. The trees they came from would have had to have been enormously tall, 15 stories tall, and at least 6 meters or 6 yards in diameter. After an archaeological dig that found these 3 conjoined piers that matched up almost exactly to the engineering renderings that had been created in the 80s, it suddenly became clear that that myth was actually fact. Not only that, after finding these pillars, realizing that this structure had once existed, the original plan for the site was also found. Now, this doesn't look like the plans we've seen before, but you can see, similar to the columns, how we have seen those as sort of dots or points on a plan. Here we have these rounded circles, 3 grouped together within one larger circle. Those 3 grouped together are the piers that we just saw in the image preceding, and they are surrounded by an iron band holding them together. So not only was the scale and height and myth of this site actually fact, through this plan we see how that construction occurred. It didn't require those massive almost imaginary sized trees, 3 were bound together to create the mass density and strength that were needed. But today, you can see Izumo there in the background with the chigi sticking out. It doesn't look like that. What happened? As with all wood structures, as you've seen through prior lectures, they are riddled with problems with fire. And after being burnt down, after some decay, this site has been rebuilt several times. The largest rebuilding was in 1248. And at that time, no central government had the money, the resources, the wood, any of the labor that would have been required to build it back to scale. So they created this, which has even in its name the idea that this is the temporary shrine, as if to say this is super important and we're going to keep the tradition going later, but we just can't rebuild it quite yet back to its original glory. All right, we'll move on to Ise Jingu now. We are now on the far eastern side of the island, the easternmost point, map point that you see here. Take a minute. While this site is commonly studied for its very early forms, which are seen as architectural archetypes, it's useful to look at Ise from the perspective of ritual rebuilding that is prevalent in Japan. There are mythologies that say that the shrine was built before the Common Era, but most archaeological and architectural evidence shows that the current site dates from 670 CE. That being said, Ise Jingu is rebuilt every 20 years. I mean, completely rebuilt every 20 years. What are the potential reasons for that? Just take a minute to think, jot down a few answers. So, one of the reasons is because the ruler in charge at the time said so. So it was rebuilt every 20 years after 670. The scale of the project, however, was really important to economic development, and rebuilding every 20 years ensured that the workers had an ongoing series of jobs, that the population had an ongoing economic engine. It's also thought that some of the materials didn't last or didn't hold up to their greatest potential longer than 20 years. 20 years is also perhaps the longest time that grains can be preserved. But one key reason why it's rebuilt every 20 years is in order to pass on traditions and techniques to the next generation. Rebuilding the site from scratch, from the bottom up, as you can see here in this important ritual that takes place as the rebuilding process begins. This is the felling of the very first tree. This whole process takes 17 years. That means for 17 years, a group of workers are employed in this ritual rebuilding. The next time the construction comes around, those earlier workers are still alive. They're still there to lead the younger generation and pass on all of their experience. In this way, the exact same techniques that were used in 670 CE are still used to build the shrine today. See the apps here that we saw in that very first painting? They're using them again. This is a tool dating back at least 1,000 years. Okay, could they be using electric screwdrivers and all sorts of other things? Sure they could. But would that carry on the tradition? Would it pass on this understanding of carpentry that we have seen as so important to historical construction in Japan? No. So everything, even the guardrails around the ponds at this site, are rebuilt every 20 years. There's one more reason that this 20-year rebuilding period exists. It's thought that Amaterasu wandered around for 20 years before she settled in this site. So out of honor to her, out of this replication of building techniques and practices, that tradition still continues. The only major break in this tradition was a 122-year long break during Sengoku's Warring States period around the 15th or 16th century. Knowing this is important because it reminds us why governments choose to rebuild things at all. At that time, there was just way too much conflict for any of the parties involved to spend the amount of money, to gather the amount of labor, and frankly, there just wasn't even enough wood. Think about the fact that they're rebuilding every 20 years. And just looking at the scale of the timber, as we can see from these workers here, and the span of these floorboards, basically. It takes 13,000 large cypress trees just to rebuild this single shrine. The trees that are required have to be roughly 300 to 400 years old in order to gain the size and length that's required. So it's pretty obvious to see that that supply and demand chain is going to falter at some point. Issei's lumber problem started to appear around 1038 when the leading manager of the rebuilding said that all of the lumber must come from imperial forests. And those imperial forests from which the wood could be sourced must have been dedicated to the rebuilding of the shrine. All right, 300 to 400 years of growth, 13,000 cypress trees. In very short order, that supply run out. So much so that in order for this practice to continue, the sites for acquisition of these trees had to be expanded. And as we mentioned, there's just no electric tools used. They're not allowed on the site. Modern workarounds have been found where they can be used in workshops off-site, and then the finished material is brought on-site. But for the most part, these attempts to cut costs led to poor craftsmanship and the decline of the building culture of Issei, and have been shunned in a way. The next building that we'll look at, Horiyuji, has similar contemporary problems. So here we are at Horiyuji. It's sandwiched in the middle of these sites, Todaishi and Asukadera. Horiyuji, the middlemost of the 5 central sites on the map, is located roughly halfway between Azuka, where the Imperial Palace was at the time, and Nara, where the Imperial Palace would move in 100 years. It also lies just off the Yamato River, connecting these two to Osaka and to other important cities around. Horiyuji is one of the oldest wooden buildings in the world, and it's been standing on the same spot since it was started in 607 CE. The Buddhist temple burnt down once again in 670 and was rebuilt, as we see here. The forms of construction here at Horiyuji appear simple, but the history of the type of maintenance has led it to be just remarkably well preserved. In 607, Prince Shotoku built his palace complex about 10 miles southwest of Nara, and Horiyuji Temple was part of this complex. What we see here is the original temple. And as you can see, the temple isn't just one building. It is a compound with gates and cloisters, main halls and pagodas, a bell tower, lecture halls, and while it's not in this picture, there's also a dining hall that has been classified as a national treasure. What we learned from the site are two different approaches to rebuilding. As you see on the left, one approach to rebuilding is the one that we saw at Ise Jingu. Horyuji, however, which we see on the right, has a different approach. Can you spot where that approach is made visible? Pause this, take some time with it. While the image on the left, we have replacement of piers, of beams, all together by absolutely brand new wood. At Horyuji, do you see this? Oh, it looks perhaps like the central post in this image that has yellow wood at the bottom and looks almost like this brown, darker wood is kind of dripping down onto the newer wood. What's happened, in fact, is while a portion of that post or column rotted out, rather than replacing the entire column, what they've done is replace just that lower part where the yellow is. That's all new wood. They have carefully pieced together the old and the new into that same post. The benefits, of course, is it takes so much less wood to do this. It does take a little more time, as you can't just put one solid post up. You have to match the old and the new together with precision. But it does also help solve that problem of supply and demand that was so detrimental and so pressing at Ise Jingu. Another reason why Horyuji is so special is just the detail that we see here illustrates so many of the fascinating techniques of Japanese building. You can see here on the right the way the interiors of the buildings here are constructed. And note, okay, if you think about that post and lintel structure, here the horizontal lintels, rather than sitting on top of the posts, can you see that the posts have rectangles cut out and those lintels go all the way through? It's a very different strength that's created there. It's one that doesn't require nails, it doesn't require any other sort of adhesive, as the structure is weighted and carved into itself in some way. At this site, we have a history of construction, of carpentry, where one of the carpenters at Horyuji wrote down just what it is to be a carpenter. What are the requirements of carpentry? While they're sort of impenetrable to modern thought, there are several things that still make sense. For example, number 3, in picking materials for the temple, don't buy the wood, but buy the mountain. What Nishioka is saying is think long term. Think about this as something enduring into the future. Don't supply it for now, supply it for always. There are a series of other points of wisdom that he sees as the secrets of the trade, of the secrets of carpentry, built into his ancient document. Here we can see the composition of the pillars at Horyuji. The carpentry skill, the way that you can see the hand of the carpenter in what look like kind of waves in the wood itself. Another place we see that skill is in joinery like this. Examine it for a minute. Just look at all the different slopes, the different elements that are going in to make this elegant but also highly functional joint with no nails. Finally, we'll look at Toraiji. Originally completed in 758, this building was rebuilt in 1709 based on a reconstruction that happened in 1195. We'll see why that's important in a minute. Here we are back at our map. Todaiji is the uppermost site to the right, below Kyoto. Todaiji is one of the 4 buildings that we are looking at today. It's the last of the 4, and it allows a fabulous wealth of records concerning its construction and reconstruction. First, just take a look at some of the parts of the roof tile, the original roof tiles that we see here. The detail, the care in just making these tile caps. Again, we see that decorative impulse really coming through. When Todaiji was constructed, the central government was really at its peak, and it was implementing a very new style and of both architecture and administrative codes that came directly from Chinese influence. Todaiji was so enormous that it required the creation of a new government department all to itself. It had its own bureau charged with building Todaiji. The structure and function of Todaiji takes direct influence from Chang'an, which was a city created during the Tang Dynasty in China. Chang'an was still the capital of China when Nara was being built, and it is truly one of the great cities of the world, and one of the most important in East Asia. Nearly 3 million inhabitants lived inside the walls that we're looking at right now, and 2 million lived outside in the surrounding suburbs. This is really remarkable for 618 to 907 CE. It's a tremendous population. Chang'an is positioned at the end of the Silk Road, which crossed Asia, and all manner of goods from furniture and spices were traded in the city's 2 great marketplaces, which you see marked out here on the map. Just take a minute to look at the organization. It's clear that this was a gridded city. There's symmetry in the East Market, the West Market, and what happens with each of the neighborhood districts throughout the city itself. I'm going to post a video for you to get more detail. Be sure to listen to it. It's fascinating. Here, we see the map of Todaiji, and you can see that symmetrical influence once again. We have the West Pagoda and the East Pagoda, where the West Market and the East Market were in Chang'an. And we have that administrative and religious set of sectors in the upper quadrant, upper center of the map. Much of the information on this temple, this Buddhist temple, comes from 2 documents. They were written during the 7th and 8th centuries. They tell a tale of the reasons behind the construction, about the festivals that were held to celebrate its construction, the ceremonies that inaugurated the building, as well as the size of the building, the materials used, and the people involved. What did we learn from those? So, 51,590 man days, or days fully worked by a single man, were needed to work on the timber alone for this shrine. 51,590. There was a huge corvée labor source, or mandatory unpaid labor source, involved as well. From this image, you can see the monumental scale of the timber that was needed to create Todaiji. Again, we're looking at cypress trees, which grow up to 120 feet tall, 12 stories. They're very straight, they have a tight grain, and they split easily into long beams. They're also resistant to rot. This made them an ideal material for most of the temples we've just looked at. So this would be the Buddhist temple to end all Buddhist temples. That was the thought when it was constructed, and certainly I think it's succeeded. By far the most prestigious and wood-demanding project was the Imperial Monastery at Todaiji. This is supported by 84 massive cypress pillars. We see just a few of them here. To get those pillars themselves, 2,200 acres of local forests were cut down and utilized. 118 dams were built just to transport the wood from the forest to the site. It's a massive environmental undertaking to create this single temple. Forests, rivers, all that is surrounding this region, and even further out in this region, is being appropriated, put into use, activated for the construction of this single temple. It doesn't stop there. Can you see the Buddhist bronze sculpture here in the back? It's said that 2.6 million man days were needed, which means that roughly half of the population of Japan at the time was involved in the creation of this statue alone. You can see the scale here. This colossal Buddha used up all of Japan's copper resources at the time, including the metal in women's hand mirrors. All of them were donated is maybe questionable. All of them had to be given to the court to be melted down to create this Buddha statue. The statue's shoulders alone are about 28 yards across. There are 960 curls on the top of the head, and that halo itself is about 87 feet in diameter. They're huge. This thing is huge. So for the festival of the Buddha's inauguration, 100,000 monks, 40,000 artisans, dancers, and other performers were brought to the site for a series of performances that is truly still unparalleled to this day. As you can see, if you look carefully, a painter was brought to slowly open the eyes of the Buddha by painting that iris, that slit of the eye, through those widening spheres. It would have been dramatic. It would have been like a multimedia show that no one at the time has ever seen. So this Great Hall of the Buddha has taken on several different sizes. We know this from, if you could see this wooden square at the top of the image I'm showing you, along the bottom, just barely, you could see kind of black markings there. Those black markings, after careful study has been done, x-rays, all sorts of technology used to see what was really written or etched in there, these sections that we see just below are what was being shown. And here we see the sizes of this primary Great Buddha Hall over time. On the left, we have the 8th century, the original construction, the 13th century next to that, 17th century, which is the current structure, and then the 17th century proposed but unable to be executed, again, just due to the material constraints. Records show that many parts of the compound were constantly being repaired. They required a constant staff of carpenters, much like Ise. However, as the central government weakened, it left the temple to others to decide if it would be rebuilt or how it would be restored. That led to decisions such as the loss of the West Gate. The pagodas were no longer reconstructed. You can see them here in this full model of the site. But of course, If you went to the site today, this is what it looks like. Okay, but still those pagodas, we need to talk about that. Before we do though, the human cost for this temple was enormous. It took 50,000 carpenters, 370,000 metal workers, and over 2 million laborers to build Todaiji. It's just a monumental project on a scale that's hard to fathom. All right, so to those pagodas, this is just one of the technological marvels of Todaiji in Nara. So see that central pillar running up the center of the temple? Hold on.
Earthquakes are among the most powerful of all natural disasters, leveling buildings and triggering tsunamis. Neighbouring Japan is the most seismically active country on Earth. For years, no one could understand why regular buildings would collapse in earthquakes, while traditional pagodas stayed standing.
この五重塔、当時の五重塔は高さ51メートルですね。日本で一番高い五重塔です。それがこのように約400年間大きな地震、それから強い台風に耐えてきました。これ本当に素晴らしいことだと思います。
Modern studies of pagoda design eventually revealed the secret.
まず第一に非常に柔らかい構造ですよね。多くのジョイントがあって、それから食い物もありますし、柔らかい構造なんですね。ですから、地震が来ると、スネークダンス説というそういう説を唱えた先生もいますけれども、要するに蛇がこうね歩くように、そういうような例えで強度を示すことがありますけれども、くねくねとこう強度をする。
Pagodas are typically 5 floors high, but each floor is capable of moving independently. So, when a quake strikes, its snake-like pattern keeps the center of gravity more upright than a rigid building would. The wooden joints that support each floor consist of several separate components, so each part can slide and move, and the friction they create acts like a damper to soften that movement.
接合部が多くの接合部がところでエネルギーをですね吸収するというシステムを持っているわけです。
Fascinating. Just this early technological engineering that is still one of the best solutions for integrity in a building against earthquakes. All right, let's look at one more just confounding wooden creation. What you're seeing here are two famed sculptures that are part of a concentration of talent that emerged in a group of artists known as the Kai School of Sculpture. They're considered by many to be the peak of Japanese sculpture. Before I tell you what they're noted for, take a minute to look at these. What stands out in these figures as you look at them? The artist Unkai, who directed the creation of these, if not handling each part by hand himself, was considered the leading figure of the Kai school. And his distinctive style really emerged in his work at Nara, particularly in Todaiji. He's noted, as the rest of the Kai school is, for hypermusculature, of really emphasizing the anatomy of the figures in his work. You can see, look at the calf, the figure on the right. Look at that right calf that is extending out. Look at all the muscle, tendons. It's hyper lifelike. at the same time, this sort of sculpture, this sort of natural flowing series of fabrics, this is all created out of wood, but it looks like those are garments really flowing in the wind. This is all due to a careful and considered study of how fabrics move, what influence wind has on different textiles, how the body changes its shape as it shifts from one side to the other, as it steps, as we reach our hands out. Even the facial detail there is really incredible. The other thing that is present in these sculptures is what's called contrapposto. Here's an example of that change. We see the rigidity in the image in the far left. There's a little more naturalism in the stance in the center. And then we get to things by Michelangelo and the Kai School, where you can imagine a body actually standing like that. It's exceptionally executed here. All right, that's all I've got for today. Soak it in. If that video didn't work, I will put a clip of it here in the module for you to view about the earthquake-proof constructions. All right, take care.